You'll see on the screen, everybody, we've got 48 people with us so far. I'm hoping you can see my face as well. Can somebody give me another thumbs up? We're testing out all our technology skills here. So I'm going to start and start the session. So there's 49 of us here at the moment, so that's a great attendance. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. What you'll see on the front screen is that names and emails are not visible to others, and that cameras are turned off and microphones are muted. Raise your hands to unmute or use the chat. So I do see that somebody's got their hand up, so I just need to know, Amna, how we're managing that. Is that for somebody to put comments in the chat?
Marie's got the chat. Yeah, I think the hand's been put down now.
And then at some point, folks, we do need to unmute you, because I'd like to have a conversation as well once we've done the presentation. So we will at some point ensure that we can have some active engagement with you, which is really important. So the session will be covering a sensitive theme. It is to do with domestic abuse related deaths, whether that be in the adult world, the children's world in terms of the safeguarding arenas, or whether it be under the Community Safety Partnership. The webinar will be recorded, hence why the cameras are turned off. You know, people might not want to be seen, but it is important that we keep a record of this so others can access it in the future. So this webinar, once it's been put together, will be put on the Office of Police Crime Commissioner website, and then we invite you then to kind of other people in your organisation to be able to access that, so we don't lose the learning and we get it as widespread as we can. Between us, so you've got Marie, Morgan, Amna, myself, and there's other colleagues as well. We're going to try and monitor the chat as well. So if there's anything that's coming up on there, then please just get it written down. But what we're going to do first and foremost is go through the presentation. This was delivered in an in-person session, and it was much longer. So I'm going to need to just kind of ensure that we manage time well, because we've only got an hour. So, and I want some time for us to do some engagement. My name's Durrant, and I am the independent chair of the Safeguarding Adults Board in Hull and East Riding, and I'm the independent chair and scrutineer within the Children's Partnership in Hull. The work that we've done on this is for all 4 areas. So what's really important is its inclusion. It's about all our areas in North East Lincolnshire, North Lincolnshire, East Riding and in Hull. So next slide, please. So the purpose of this webinar is to share Humber-wide learning, strengthen multi-agency understanding, and support prevention and workforce development. And the learning shared today has been drawn from multiple reviews across the Humber and analysed collectively to identify recurring system patterns rather than individual case detail. So what this review is and is not, it's just a short-term piece of work led by myself and working with Amna, who you'll soon meet as well, who is a research assistant with the Police Crime Commissioner's Office. And we've got Marie Morgan, who many of you may know, who is a strategic lead in that particular area. So what this review is and is not, it's not a re-review of cases. You've all got loads of work going on. It's not a performance audit of agencies. It's a cross-case analysis of recurring patterns across published reviews. Some of them, I'm going to explain in a minute, might be unpublished, but that's just because they're waiting for the ratification through the Home Office. And the learning reflects system behaviours. It's not about individual decisions. And the learning's been synthesised across cases to identify themes, missed opportunities, and importantly, examples of good practice. So just to give you a little bit of context then, a need was identified to further strengthen learning across all 4 areas. It was a light touch review, predominantly in the last 5 years. I think there was 2 cases that spanned a little bit wider, but we felt it was important to include them. You'll see in there that the largest proportion are what used to be called a domestic homicide review, now called a DARDR. It's like a new language if you've not been in this world, which is a domestic abuse related death review. And it also looked locally at the Children's Partnership, and we looked at local safeguarding child practice reviews, so they're the ones that go to the national panel, and SARS, safeguarding adult reviews. And we picked those 3 because they had domestic abuse featured within them. And nationally, a recent review of over 650 cases in relation to adult reviews, 18% were domestic abuse related. So it's important that we always look wider across the different partnerships. We also took the opportunity to pick another 5 cases where local learning had been done, where domestic abuse featured, but it wasn't at that statutory end. But we wanted to make it real for us locally. So we reviewed the learning related to where it was there, weapon-enabled homicides, unpublished but concluded reviews, and it was co-produced, this work, with strategic and operational leads from all 4 areas. And it identified common themes, issues, missed opportunities, and as I said earlier, examples of good practice, and this isn't around naming anybody in there. Next slide, please. So why did we do it then? Domestic abuse related deaths shows consistent patterns across local authority areas. Learning is often identified in isolation rather than synthesized across systems, and the review connects learning to support moving forward prevention and system improvement. Definitely this is not about blame, it's system learning, good practice and patterns across reviews, 29 of them in our locality, folks. So why these patterns persist? We've had a couple of questions come in advance of this webinar, and actually some great questions coming in, because the question is, the biggie is, why does we keep having the same things happening over and over and over again, the same kind of themes and patterns that come up? Some of the reasons, system drivers, may be related to threshold pressures. High thresholds can lead to risk being managed at the lowest level sometimes until we get to crisis point. Fragmented systems and pathways, therefore, risk information sits across agencies without consistent triangulation or ownership. Capacity and workload constraints. Everybody, the demand is so high for you all. Time pressures sometimes can limit reassessment, escalation and reflective practice. And the normalisation of risk over time is a consideration we had too. Repeated incidents become familiar, reducing perceived urgency. These are just questions for us to consider, folks. Next slide, please. So how Humber-wide learning aligns with national then? So it reflects well-established national patterns. So what's happening nationally is happening locally. And in around 3/4 of cases nationally, domestic abuse was known to 1 or more agencies prior to death. You'll see that pattern here. Strangulation as it is a high-risk precursor. And again, we've got the legislation now in terms of that being criminalised. Risk recognised but not escalated. So again, more patterns nationally that we can see locally. And this is a big one for me. Cumulative harm and repeat incidents were not always connected across agencies. It's that bit sometimes about looking at a single incident and not looking at all the history, and then add a layer to that of actually putting that across different systems within the multi-agency arena, including our absolute necessary and really important community voluntary sector, and all the other statutory agencies and providers. So we'll give you some, you can have copies of this PowerPoint as well, but we'll give you some reference document on there. So the overview of common themes across the cases reviewed consistently, that again, this is our area. Domestic abuse was often known in our area. Risk factors were frequently identified in isolation, same as the national. Information sharing occurred, but was often partial, delayed, or not translated into action. And again, we need to be action focused. If we've got this, what are we going to do? And collectively, how can we help and support one another? Professional curiosity escalation and coordinated multi-agency responses were not consistent as we need them to be. There were good practices, but there were elements of inconsistency that kept featuring. So where good practice did occur, it was usually linked to strong supervision, specialist involvement, and clear accountability. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Amna now. Amna can obviously introduce herself, but she has been amazing doing all this work to support me in this, in terms of her analytical skills and communication skills. She's been fantastic. So Amna, I'm going to hand over to you, and we're going to work through some of the themes in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Kay. Hi everyone, I'm Amna. I'm the Graduate Research Assistant at the OPCC and Humber VPP. Just going to go through some of the key issues. So one of the most strongest and consistent findings across the Humber reviews is that domestic abuse was known to services prior to the death. In many cases, there had been multiple disclosures, police call-outs, health contacts, or third sector involvement. However, what we repeatedly see is that abuse was framed as historic, episodic, or low level, even where there were clear indicators of escalation. Repeat incidents were often managed as standalone events rather than understood as a pattern of coercive control or cumulative harm. As a result, thresholds for MARAC or specialist intervention were not always met, not because the risk wasn't there, but because it was underestimated when viewed in isolation. This pattern cuts across familial and intimate partner cases, including those involved in coercive control and explicit threats to kill. Across the reviews, we saw that risk assessment tools were often completed, but completion did not always translate into escalation or action. High-risk indicators such as separation, threats, substance misuse, mental health deterioration, pregnancy, and non-fatal strangulation were not consistently weighed in decision-making. In some cases, risk to victims appeared to be minimised where perpetrators were already known to services for other reasons, for example, probation or mental health. There were also repeated missed opportunities to reassess risk when circumstances changed, such as reconciliation, pregnancy, relocation, or disengagement from services. What this tells us is that risk assessment was often treated as static when domestic abuse is fundamentally dynamic and cumulative. Another recurring theme is that different agencies often held different parts of the risk picture. Information was shared, but not always triangulated, meaning that no single agency had a full understanding of the level of risk. In some cases, information sharing lacked clarity around purpose, expectation, or next steps. There was also evidence of assumptions that another agency was dealing with it, leading to drift. Governance issues sometimes delayed safeguarding action, even where thresholds to override consent were met. The issue here is not information sharing in principle, it's what happens after information is shared. Professional curiosity emerged as a cross-cutting theme across multiple reviews. Risk indicators were often visible, but explanations were accepted at surface level, particularly where engagement was inconsistent. Disengagement, missed opportunities, or apparent non-compliance were sometimes interpreted as choice rather than as potential indicators of fear, coercion, or control. There was evidence that practitioners were at times reluctant to challenge decisions, thresholds, or plans set by other agencies. Escalation and use of professional challenge processes existed, but were used inconsistently. This points to a cultural issue around confidence, permission, and psychological safety within the system. Across cases, adult, child, and family risks were often assessed separately rather than as part of a single system. The impact of familial abuse, adult-child to parent abuse, caring roles, and dependency were frequently underestimated. Fathers, partners, and male family members were sometimes invisible in assessments, either as risks or as potential victims. Whole family planning and multi-agency meetings were not consistently used to coordinate responses. This matters because domestic abuse rarely affects just one individual. It reshapes the entire family ecology.
Amna, can we just go on and do the rest of the presentation? It's just, I think, might bring everybody together at the end. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I'm just going to go through the other key findings and nationally recognised themes. We spoke about a few at the start of the presentation. Kay spoke about a few. So this next slide highlights how suicide often occurred alongside domestic abuse and wider vulnerability, rather than in isolation. The reviews show that suicidal ideation was present but fluctuated over time, and wasn't always reassessed as circumstances changed. This meant that increase in risk wasn't always identified or responded to. A key issue was that domestic abuse wasn't consistently recognised as contributing to a mental health crisis. Risk was often viewed through a mental health lens alone, without fully considering coercion, control, and trauma. We also found that information wasn't always shared across agencies, meaning that no single agency and no single professional had the full picture. In some cases, multiple services led to fragmented support rather than coordinated care. In practice, this means that we need to continuously review suicide risk, recognising it can change over time. It also reinforces routinely exploring domestic abuse within mental health contexts, improving information sharing, and ensure clear coordination. Overall, suicide prevention needs to be more explicitly recognised. Recognise domestic abuse as a key risk factor to ensure that responses are more holistic and better aligned to individuals' lived experience. Across the Humber cases, weapon-enabled abuse featured prominently. Several cases involved stabbing, strangulation, or explicit threats with weapons. In some instances, non-fatal strangulation was present prior to the homicide, which we know nationally is a significant predictor of future lethal violence. What is particularly concerning is that weapon use was not always treated as an automatic indicator of high or imminent risk. In some cases, incidents involving weapons were managed as isolated events rather than understood as part of an escalating pattern of coercive control and violence. We also saw that prior assaults involving weapons did not always trigger MARAC referral or specialist escalation. This suggests that although the behaviour itself was highly dangerous, it was not consistently recognised as meeting thresholds for enhanced safeguarding responses. Weapon use, and particularly strangulation, should be treated as a critical red flag that demands immediate multi-agency attention. Ultimately, these cases highlight the need for clearer thresholds, stronger escalation pathways, and collective confidence in treating weapon-enabled domestic abuse as a critical safeguarding concern rather than as a situational incident. Across multiple cases, abuse was carried out by adult children or other family members. These situations often looked very different from what services traditionally associate with domestic abuse. They were frequently embedded within caring relationships, shared housing, and long-term dependency. In some cases, the person causing the harm was also providing care, financial support, or housing. This made the abuse harder to recognise and more difficult for victims to disclose, as they feared losing essential support or destabilising family arrangements. Victims describe their experiences in terms of family stress, conflict, or burden rather than as abuse. As a result, professionals sometimes reframed risk as family conflict or relationship breakdown, rather than recognising coercion, control, or harm. Practitioners working with older adults must be supported to ask direct questions about safety, control, and fear, not just the care needs. This also reinforces the importance of a whole family and a cross-sector approach, linking adult safeguarding, domestic abuse services, and health and social care more effectively. Ultimately, these cases tell us that vulnerability can be hidden behind labels like carer, son, daughter, or family support. Our responsibility is to remain professionally curious and ensure that safeguarding responses focus on risk and lived experience, not just relationship status. Across Humber reviews, male victimisation was present, but it was inconsistently recognised or escalated. In several cases, men were less likely to be identified as victims, and where concerns were raised, they were less likely to be explored in depth or referred into specialist domestic abuse support. When men did disclose abuse, those disclosures were sometimes minimised, reframed as mutual conflict, or not followed up with a full risk assessment or referral. A particular pattern we noticed was that domestic abuse was not consistently explored when men presented with mental health distress, substance use, or relationship breakdown. These presentations were often responded to in isolation, without curiosity about whether abuse might be a contributing factor. Domestic abuse risk assessment and inquiry must be gender inclusive and grounded in behaviour and risk rather than assumptions. Practitioners also need to be alert to additional barriers faced by male victims, including stigma, fear of disbelief, and the limited visibility of services. And critically, routine inquiry, merit consideration, and safeguarding responses must apply equally regardless of gender. If our systems only recognise abuse when it looks the way we expect it to, then we will continue to miss people who are at serious risk. Across the Humber reviews, we saw that where English was not a person's first language, there were missed opportunities to fully understand risk, lived experience, and the level of control present within abusive relationships. In several cases, communication barriers limited the depth of disclosure, not because risk was absent, but because it was harder for individuals to safely explain what was happening to them. This included difficulties describing coercive control, fear, or escalation, particularly where sensitive language was needed. We also saw reliance on informal interpretation, including family members, or in some cases, the abusive partner. Information can be filtered, minimised, or shaped by power dynamics, and it undermines the safety and independence of the disclosure. Written safety plans, discharge information, and follow-up arrangements were not always provided in accessible languages. This meant that even when risk was recognised, individuals may not have fully understood what support was available, what actions were expected, or how to seek help safely. Importantly, language barriers were sometimes misinterpreted as disengagement. Missed opportunities, limited responses, or apparent reluctance to engage were occasionally viewed through a compliance lens rather than as potential indicators of fear, coercion, or lack of understanding. The learning here is not simply about translation, it's about recognising communication barriers as a safeguarding issue in their own right. This next slide brings together learning across the reviews about moments where different decisions, stronger coordination, or clearer escalation could have potentially altered outcomes. In several cases, risk indicators were present for some time before escalation occurred. Domestic abuse was known, but responses were not brought into a coordinated multi-agency space where risk could be fully understood and shared. Another recurring theme was the need for reassessment of risk following key changes in circumstances, which are well evidenced points of increased danger, yet in some cases risk was allowed to remain static rather than being actively reviewed as situations changed. In some cases, there was no single professional or agency clearly holding oversight of the plan. Actions were taken, but responsibility for driving the response forward was diffuse, leading to gaps in follow-up and coordination. Professional challenge was another area where opportunities were missed. This sometimes led to decisions being accepted rather than tested, even where practitioners had concerns. Finally, there were missed opportunities to integrate adult mental health, substance misuse, and domestic abuse responses more effectively. This meant that the full picture of vulnerability and danger were not always brought into a single safeguarding conversation. The key message from this slide is that prevention does not sit in one movement or in one service. It sits in how we connect information, respond dynamically to change, and act decisively when risk increases. This slide brings together the most consistent recommendations that appeared across the reviews. What's important to stress is that these are not isolated actions for single agencies. They point to shared system responsibilities. Across the reviews, domestic abuse was rarely about one single incident. It was about patterns over time, control, fear, isolation, and escalation. The recommendation is that practitioners across all services need a stronger shared understanding of how coercive control operates and how cumulative risk builds, even when individual incidents appear low level. Risk assessment tools were often completed, but the reviews found that professional judgment was not always fully applied. Practitioners need to be confident to interpret risk holistically, draw connections across information, and escalate when their professional instinct tells them something is wrong. A third area of learning is embedding trauma-informed and think family approaches across services. A trauma-informed whole family approach helps services understand behaviour in context and avoid seeing disengagement or resistance as non-compliance rather than potential fear or control. Clarifying information sharing responsibilities and consent thresholds was another recurring recommendation. The learning here is about clarity and confidence, knowing when to share, who to share with, and being clear about purpose and the next steps. Finally, ensuring consistent MARAC referrals where high-risk indicators are present was a key system message. High-risk markers were not always triggering MARAC in a consistent way. The recommendation is not simply to increase referrals, but to make escalation more consistent and more proportionate to risk. These recommendations give us a framework for moving from learning to action by embedding these principles into everyday practice, training, supervision, and multi-agency working. It is important to say that while many of the reviews highlight missed opportunities and system challenges, they also identify examples of strong and effective practice. These examples show us what works when the system functions well and where we can build consistency. One area of good practice was persistent engagement with victims using trauma-informed approaches. This persistence created opportunities for disclosure and support that would have otherwise not have happened. Another positive theme was effective multi-agency working, where there was a clearly identified lead professional. This reduced duplication and prevented assumptions that someone else was dealing with it. Timely referrals to specialist domestic abuse services and safeguarding hubs also stood out as good practice. These referrals helped ensure that risk was managed through a specialist expertise rather than remaining solely within universal services. Strong supervision and management oversight was another protective factor. Supervision acted as a space for challenge, reassurance, and escalation when needed. Finally, good quality recording was consistently associated with stronger practice. This supported continuity and reduced the risk of fragmented responses. However, one of the most important messages from this learning is that good practice was not consistently embedded system-wide. It appeared in pockets, rather than as standard practice across all services and all cases. These examples show us that improvement is achievable. The challenge for us collectively is to turn these examples of good practice into everyday practice. When we looked across the reviews, where outcomes were stronger, some very consistent features of practice emerged. These were not linked to one profession or one service, they were about how people work together. First, curiosity and professional challenge were actively encouraged. Practitioners did not simply accept the first explanation they were given. This culture of curiosity reduced the risk of assumptions going untested. Secondly, risk was treated as dynamic rather than static. In these cases, risk assessments were not seen as a one-off task, but as something that needed to be revisited as circumstances changed. Another common factor was that practitioners understood their role within the wider system. This reduced fragmentation and helped prevent gaps between services. Victims' lived experience remained central to decision-making. Where practice was strongest, decisions were grounded in what life was actually like for the person experiencing the abuse. This included listening to fear, hesitation, and changes in behaviour as indicators of risk. Finally, safeguarding was treated as a shared responsibility. Agencies worked together with clarity about who was leading, who was contributing, and how plans would be reviewed. What this tells us is about culture, curiosity, shared accountability, and keeping the victim's experience at the centre of the system response. Finally, these key messages bring together what the Humber-wide learning is telling us about how practice needs to evolve going forward. These are not new ideas, but the consistency with which they appear across the reviews makes them critical. Domestic abuse risk must be understood as dynamic and cumulative. Our systems must be designed to recognise escalation over time, not just immediate crisis. Weapon use, strangulation, and threats must trigger immediate escalation. The learning is clear. These behaviours are not just concerning, they are lethal warning signs. Our response needs to be automatic, consistent, and decisive. Older victims and familial abuse require equal safeguarding focus. Domestic abuse was not limited to intimate partner relationships. This highlights the need to ensure our safeguarding frameworks recognise risk beyond traditional partner-based models of domestic abuse. Next, we need to continuously review suicide risk, recognising it can change over time. It also reinforces exploring domestic abuse within mental health contexts, improving information sharing and ensure clear coordination. Information sharing must lead to decisive action, not reassurance. Information sharing only has value if it drives decisions, escalations, and protective action. Otherwise, it can create a false sense of safety. Finally, professional curiosity, challenge, and supervision are critical protective factors. Taken together, these messages are about moving from awareness to action. They require us not just to refine policies, but to strengthen culture, how confident people feel to challenge, how systems support escalation, and how consistently learning is embedded across agencies. Thank you. I'll now pass back to Kay.
Okay, folks. So just want to thank Amna. I think that was really well presented around the work that was done to look at these 29 cases, the themes that have come up, and some of that analysis that has gone on to kind of understand it in context. So there's a slide on here. What would we need to do differently tomorrow to prevent the same patterns appearing in the next review? I got a lovely challenge recently off a survivor, a victim, now survivor of domestic abuse, saying, take out the word tomorrow, Kay, and replace it with today. And she was right. Because what do we need to do differently today to prevent the same patterns? It's in the here, it's in the now, and it's absolutely around. If we know all of these things keep repeating, if we know what works well, what needs to change in the system, and as individuals, I think we've got 55, 56 left, what can change in individual practice in your own roles? So I'm just inviting you to consider this. Where do we still struggle most as a system? What would have made the biggest difference, and what can we do differently now? To just have a think around that in the context of our webinar. Because it's not fully interactive, we've got the chat, and we did ask beforehand around any questions. So I'm just going to ask Amna, I think two people had sent in questions in advance, and I'm just going to talk through some reflections of mine. But then what I'm going to invite in the 20 minutes we've got left is anybody to raise their hand and tell us what your thoughts are, tell us what your reflections are, tell us what your kind of thoughts are in relation to what can we do differently today in relation to some of these key themes. But the questions, Amna, what was the first one?
The questions that we got sent in, the first was, just checking, can you see that screen?
We've not got it as a shared, but you can just read it out, Amna, that's fine.
Perfect. So we got the question of, how are actions of the perpetrator considered when there are no convictions or police call-outs? That was the first question. The second question was, across the DHRs reviewed, what systematic failures recur most often, and why do you think these persist despite repeated recommendations?
So, folks, I'm going to start with the second one, because I think the second one has in part been answered by the presentation around what our thoughts are, and you're going to get copies of these presentation that you can consider afterwards in your own locality. But actually, I think it's a great question to ask, so thank you for the person that sent that in. It is important that we understand the why. It's the biggest question. Why do these things keep happening over and over and over again? And then for me, the action focus bit is, so what we're going to do about it? If it's because workload's too high, tolerance to risk, as become maybe not in proportion to the facts, cumulative harm is not being considered, then what do we need to do about that? For me, slowing down thinking as individual practitioners, middle managers, senior managers is really important. What is it I'm dealing with here? Who else do I need in that process? And it's that multi-agency bit we shared. Let's get in a multi-agency space, even if that's in the early help arena of adults, children, world. Let's have a conversation and just talk about kind of what is the picture we've got at the moment. The reforms for the Families First programme and community hubs will be part of the solution, as will adults and children and CSP really tightly working together well across the system. You can't look at anything in isolation. So I think there's more we need to be doing in our DA strategic groups. You've got one in each area, but then the operationalisation of that, the engagement with practitioners from all agencies, and keep having those spaces to talk about what's working well. And I think audit plays its role as well. When we audit cases, we learn, and it's about how we get that learning out in a do with way, not a do to way. You know, it's not about the blame element, it's about keep improving practice, because that will make the difference to those who are being subjected to domestic abuse. The first question is a really interesting one because it focuses on, so again, thank you to the person asking that, it focuses on the area of what if it's not getting reported to the police, and what if there's not a statutory process, i.e. prosecution. How do we manage this? So it's not just about we don't know about it, it's just that we haven't got a criminal route and we haven't got reports coming in through the policing mechanism. I think for me, this is around every agency and every community having domestic abuse awareness raising, which is why there's lots of campaigns and everything, because it's about how do we talk to one another about we're worried about somebody. And actually, what are some of the solutions if it isn't the criminal justice route? I went to a meeting recently where we looked at the different suite of things that we're doing with relation to perpetrator behaviour, because actually I think historically conversations around being too victim focused wasn't around the solution. What we're doing about perpetrators, which I think this question kind of aligns to. And I think that it's a really important point that we know about things like, it's called CARA, which is a new conditional caution process for first-time offenders at low level. What more can we do in that space? In all your different areas, you'll have, like I know in Hull, there's Strength to Change, and the Crossroads in East Riding, there's PODAS. There'll be things definitely with the Blue Door on the South Bank, and others that are doing so much more in relation to engagement with perpetrators where it's not in the criminal justice field. We've got civil protection orders, we need to use them. But again, I got asked recently, how do we support social workers who are engaging with the family where there's no prosecution? How can we help and support them? And for me, that's about the DA specialists working with social workers in the learning field to help them navigate what assessments they're undertaking with families where domestic abuse features, alongside sometimes mental health and substance misuse. And there are so many other kind of projects. So those two people that put it in, thank you so much. And that's just my reflection. There'll be much more. I'm now going to start having a look at the messages. So Gareth has written, I feel better awareness of services available that can support with domestic abuse for victims and perpetrators. Some professionals working in the health and social care are unaware of what is available and how to refer. This may support. That's absolutely, Gareth. Thanks so much for that. It is how do we keep telling each other what we all do? How do we raise that awareness? And how do we help and support each other to keep connected and know that we can ask somebody else, what about you and what about you? So yeah, definitely. Marie, some services for those who harm are listed here. So Marie's put on the chat, folks, some links, help to stop abusive behaviours, and alongside support for those experiencing domestic abuse. There's a link there on the OPCC website to domestic abuse support. So take any of those links, folks, if you don't have them. But I think Gareth's point about we don't know what we don't know, so therefore we've got to keep having conversations to know more. I went to an event recently that East Riding was running, and I learned loads. You know, every day is a learning day for us all. So I just want to invite anybody now to either put their hand up, put something in the comment, or anything that you think, let's have it shared today on this webinar, either as a discussion point or as a point of kind of note that we need to do more on. Because what Amna and I are going to do at the end of this with Marie is ensure that we have a record of any feedback that you give us, any points of note, whether that be from practitioner, middle leader, community voluntary, strategic, whoever. Your voice is absolutely critical in this. So if there's anything that you want to feed back in, please do so. We will ask for some feedback as well. So yes, I've got a hand up. Thank you. So can we unmute? And I don't know how this bit's working, but Victoria, please. Oh, and you put your camera on. Hi, Victoria. Tell us who you are and tell us what your thoughts are.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I am Victoria Burton. I'm a lecturer and a researcher in social work. Some of you might know me from the evaluation team on the VPP as well. So I train social workers as well. So just to let you know, our social workers in Hull get a lot of input on coercive control and victimisation, perpetration, children. So yeah, but I just wanted to say thank you. That was such a well-considered, well thought out analytical presentation. Really impressed with that. So thank you for both of your work and everybody who's been involved with it. Lots to think about. And I suppose my question, I have loads of questions, but my main questions are the things I've written down are about, well, what I'm going to ask today is about gender really. And interested to know what the gender breakdown of the homicides would be, and the comments around being gender sensitive and gender informed, which are absolutely critical. Our risk assessment tools don't always allow us to cater for the needs of more diverse groups. So thinking in particular, men, Black, minority ethnic communities, LGBT, if you think about all the groups where there might be different, more unique forms of control and abuse, including men, and the themes that you highlighted in terms of male victims, they're the themes that appear in the research I've been looking at very recently, that when coercive control is present in male victims, it presents in a very similar way, actually, to female victims. But you have the whole issue of dual identity around victimisation and perpetration, and who is doing what to whom, and how you identify that. And I suppose, again, my comments are around gender operates in terms of victims and perpetrators, but also in terms of the workforce. So, for example, as a social worker, if you look at the workforce, I was just looking at Social Work England data this week, 70 to 80% female social workers. And then when you ask the question about why does this keep happening, when we know kind of some of the themes that you've flagged, I just wonder how we address those issues of gender that get tangled up in the very difficult relational dynamics, and they are part of control and coercive control. So and I know from looking at the research on this topic as well, that in 20 years in terms of engaging with men, we haven't made that much progress. And that isn't a Humber-wide comment at all, because there's amazing things happening in Humber. I think there's an event next week. So sorry, that was an awful lot of stuff, but I guess the issues around gender for me is central to all of this, and how we support people in working with this with confidence, because it's such skilled work.
Yeah. So many things there, Victoria, and
Sorry.
I've written a list, because what we've done at the other events and anything I've been to recently is get to know each other. Victoria, you're now on our list, but you're already involved in this work anyway. So it's really important that we keep those relationships and we find out what's going on elsewhere to keep strengthening everything, like everything you're doing to further develop the social work training is a continuing cycle all the time, looking at new different things. Amna, in the 29, in relation to any of those being male victims, just in terms of that, can you just respond to that bit, and then I'll come back to a couple of things.
Yes, so out of the 29 cases we looked at, there were 3 male victim cases amongst that.
Yeah. So only 3, Victoria, which isn't unusual, because we do get a higher percentage, but the issue is wider than that. It's about what are we doing to understand abuse in relation to domestic abuse in relation to men. It's a great presentation at Nice Riding recently by a gentleman there that talked about that through that differing lens. There's been some very high profile cases where we've maybe listened and learned from that through the media outlets, but I think it is important for me, and we won't have time now, but key for me is your question and challenge around risk assessment tools. What risk assessment tools do we give to support different professionals? Because we use the DASH form to refer in to do an assessment that may for the police. Other partners can use that tool, but not every area uses the same tool. And actually, what's a tool that might be for a social worker when they're doing an assessment, either in an adult safeguarding arena or prevention arena, or a child one? So linking that to either the Care Act or working together in the Children's Act, how do we navigate some of that to support social workers on risk assessment tools? I want to take that issue forward, actually, Victoria, because I've been asked to present at something later on in May, I think it is, to do with the VOG agenda. I think this risk assessment tool is a big, how can we support other parts of the system and how can we work together on it? So you'd be quite key in there. And the diversity issue is a massive one. Again, the recent event in East Riding had so many different, we had somebody from the Polish community, some research on the South Bank to do with the Bain community. There was so much in there, richness of the day, a lot of academic studies in there that were informing us. We need to bring all this together and share it with each other, because they were all from different institutions from the academic perspective. They weren't all Hull. We had some Midland research in there as well, and we've got somebody we had at the event that's doing a doctorate in Hull at the moment to do a domestic abuse, that came to the first in-person conference we've gone. So let's all get connected. So thank you, Victoria. I know I can't answer them all, but you're on the list, you were on it anyway, and we'll continue to do work together. So
thank you.
You're welcome. And thanks for the lovely feedback. And Amna, yeah, she's amazing, and a student of Hull. So there we go for Hull. So Roger.
Hi, Kay, it's Karen Rogers.
Oh, Karen. Hello, Karen.
Hi, Kay, you're all right. Really good presentation, thanks to you and Amna. Very interesting, lots of things to think about in there. But just an observation on the recognition of patterns of behaviour, of offending behaviour in particular. I'm currently working as the project manager for Opsoteria within Humberside, and the ethos of that is about placing more focus on the behaviour of the perpetrator or the suspect rather than that of the victim. And I think that's where we miss what's happening when we're looking at patterns of offending, because there's a massive focus on what a victim did, what a victim said, and how they behaved. And this is about moving that focus. So we're being victim centred, we're actually ensuring they've got the right support, so bespoke support in place, but at the same time focusing more on the offender behaviour and looking at how we manage that, how we how we can prevent reoccurrences and look at what we do for future. So I just wondered, and I thought maybe that's a consideration. I know there's some work being done nationally on this, because the same can be applied to domestic abuse, because there's similar sort of complexities when you're looking at rape and sexual offences as when you're looking at domestic abuse.
Yeah. Karen, I couldn't agree with you more about the perpetrator focus, and I think that is one of the biggest things that we need to kind of push as well around. It's why I wrote down earlier what is the suite of things that we've got in terms of perpetrator. I know in Hull they're doing a launch soon of the Better Man campaign, which is the engagement with men to go on programmes to prevent abuse, as well as CARA, as well as prosecution route, civil orders, MATAC, MARAC, MAPA. There's a whole list of things that go on, and there'll be more folks in other areas. But it's like, how do we bring all that together to do what you've just described, to do better on taking the focus around victim behaviour away and say, hang on, this is a victim of domestic abuse. What is it we're doing about the perpetrators? So I couldn't agree more. And some people might not know about Opsateria, and I'm sure you're linked into the multi-agency with that, Karen. And I know Rachel's put on there, I love this, Karen, so have a look at the comments. So your comments gone down really well in terms of the work that you're doing, but one, the acknowledgement of let's target perpetrator behaviours.
I think it's more in the initial stages as well, Kay, as you know, as well as subsequently. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I don't want to miss people's comment on there. Rachel, I feel creating diversity within a workforce isn't the answer. It's about personal attributes and capabilities. The statistics of female to male worker within social work context is probably well proportioned for the percentage. Thank you, Rachel. Question around Encompass has come up a few times actually at events I've been at. What happens when there are a number of Operation Encompass to the same address? So one of the things that I know we discussed at the conference was around some teachers sharing frustrations with me really around their place within Encompass, because it's like a one-way info share from a police incident into the school, with a national directive to then not tell the family that, you know, and we're doing some reviews, I know, in Hull and East Riding on Encompass. So I just want you to know that the question there won't get lost. I've got Mrs. C. Henderson to do with Encompass, because it's absolutely critical that we look at the interface with schools. And there's been a domestic incident, let's tell you about it. And then what do we do with it? And I think there's an opportunity with the Families First programme, which is child related, and education are a key partner at the table. So I promise you, from the areas I'm influencing, that will be driven forward in relation to that. Marie's saying there's a couple of places left for the event on Monday, the Better Man launch. So if you do any work that gives services in Hull and East Riding, it's actually, I think it's a Hull launch, but I don't know, I might be wrong, so Marie will correct me if I'm wrong. But this is a campaign around engaging with men to take responsibility for their behaviours and go on programmes to look at that. And there's two particular men who it's a full Humber invite. So any of you, there's some places left, folks. So if you want to go on that, the launch of it is on Monday coming. And I've seen the original video. It looks like a really good programme. It's one of a suite of things to do about holding perpetrators to account. But what we want is prevention, behaviour change. You know, some of the families want to stay together. So how can we do that in the safest way? So that's really important. So mindful of time, folks, it's 1 o'clock. I just want to thank you. There is going to be a report that's going to be put together. We are going to send on the slides, summary findings and shared learning. There'll be a short document put together, and attendees encouraged to cascade. Please share this wide as you can. There'll be a recording of it as well
on the OPCC website, so people sometimes different styles thinking of diversity, they can watch it. They can watch it without having to always have to read documents. And your views and experience matter. So thank you for attending this webinar. Let us know if there's any issues of support required. Really key that we look after each other. And I am very, very grateful for you all being here on behalf of the OPCC who's commissioned this, on behalf of Amna and I. You're amazing. Thank you. Keep doing what you're doing. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
So probably be able to stop the recording now, Amna.